Tonight,
We need performance, not politics.
David Nakhid.
We've never had an era of politicians that we can look back and say, yes, they've done well for the country as a whole.
The footballer.
The Caribbean and the African countries would be spectators to the sport.
And the fighter.
The situation in the Laventil Hills, the situation in the Mondo Hills, it cannot continue.
Tonight on ViewPoint, football's frontline fighter.
How far is Trinidad and Tobago away from exploding? David Nakhid, welcome to ViewPoint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bechu. Nice to be here.
Football is not your full story. You've always been at the forefront of socio-political issues, not only here in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the world. In fact, it cost you your job 15 years ago as part of the management team of the 2005 football team. You pointed out what some people termed as racist comments towards the Syrian Lebanese community. As such, you were fired. You're back in Trinidad and Tobago now for a bit. What do you make of TNT in 2020?
Well, I've been lucky enough to have gone up in different communities. I've been up the St. Joseph Hill, up the Mondo Hill, up the Laventil Hill, and nothing has changed. I see the same rotten infrastructure, the same dire situation socially, economically, and I think that should be of worry to any Trinbagonian citizen that is intelligent enough to know that this situation is untenable.
You're between Lebanon and Belgium with your International Football Academy, but you still very much follow Trinidad and Tobago because you write columns on Trinidad and Tobago. You left here in the early 1980s when you were 17 years old. Returning now in 2020, how different is this place?
Well, socially back then, it was a lot different. There was much more community. I think there was a lot more sense of brotherhood, especially among the poor communities. But I think the prospect of expectation that arose with the abundance of wealth that Trinidad and Tobago experienced, with the billions of dollars that the poor communities watched go by, totally consumed by the elites, political elites and the social elites, the upper classes. I think that expectation that they have missed out, that they were underserved, I think that caused what we are seeing now in Trinidad and Tobago, which is an overwhelming amount of murders, overwhelming amount of discontent among the poor youth, and even among the middle class, which has dwindled next to nothing. So we have the haves and the have-nots. And I think that situation is going to lead to a friction and eventually some kind of situation that we see now in Guyana, because our so-called Indo-Trinbagonians and our so-called Afro-Trinbagonians have been conditioned by our politicians as just a reference for a vote. And they see themselves as polar opposites, where in fact, truth and in fact, they should be brotherly on the ground. They should be working towards a better future for the country. And we should see ourselves primarily as Trinbagonians. It's fine and it's good to know our heritage, where we come from, but that should only be a launching pad for what goes forward for Trinidad and Tobago.
For the social ills and societal divisions in Trinidad and Tobago, in your writings, you don't blame one political party or one political era. In fact, I just want to quote a column that you recently wrote, and I'm quoting here. Alas, if we could at least be nostalgic for an era of honest politicians in our nation. We don't need a forensic search to tell us that wishful period never happened. Trinidad and Tobago has been independent for 58 years. How damning is such a statement for you to write?
Well, it's completely true. I think anybody who's intelligent and anybody who chooses not to put his head in the sand in Trinidad and Tobago and will realize that that's precisely what has happened in Trinidad and Tobago, that we've never had an era of politicians that we can look back and say, yes, they've done well for the country as a whole, for every single community. That doesn't mean that they have not been the odd, honest politician, but as a collective. The politicians as a collective, we've never seen that in Trinidad and Tobago. All I can do is point you to the state of Trinidad and Tobago as it is now.
What is needed then to address the social ills in our society?
First of all, we need to realize the situation that we are in. You're never going to go forward if you don't admit to the situation you are in. And I know my citizens, my people, we are very conservative socially. We don't like to engage. We like to talk. We like to criticize, but we never do. And we need people who can perform, not only get themselves involved in politics. We need performance, not politics. And I think this era that we're going to see here is going to be an era of performance, not politics.
What guides you to say that?
Well, there has to be a change. And this new generation that is coming, they realize that we've had politicians, and we've had politicians for 58 years, as you've said, and they've done basically nothing. They've all enriched themselves, and we can see it. It's clear and evident on the roads. We know who they are. We know who are the people who have been involved in the corruption. We know. And I think it would be unintelligent of us as a people to not admit to that and realize that unless we recognize the cynicism that is deeply embedded in the youth right now, they are deeply cynical.
How big a blame or a big chunk of the blame does the Trinidad and Tobago citizens have to take in our societal ills?
Well, what we've done, we have voted out parties, and that's been our problem. We've never really voted in parties over the last couple of decades. What we've done, we've held our nose and we've voted. But we've never really been constructive in the democracy that is supposed to take place in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have to change that. We have to recognize that the body is diseased, and especially on the East-West corridor. We have to admit it. That's the part where the murders are taking place. And we can't keep blaming these youths. We can't ask people to account for something when we don't give them anything to work with. And I think our politicians, and especially those who have depended upon the votes of this community, that have disappointed this community, that have turned this community not into stakeholders, but hustlers in their own community, I think we need to hold them to account.
Let's talk about the crossroads that you believe Trinidad and Tobago as a nation is at. And I just want to quote another recently written column in which you wrote, and I'm quoting again here, and you're talking to corrupt politicians here. The guns that you have allowed to turn inwards to the black communities will sooner rather than later turn outwards, and there will be a reckoning. You believe that Trinidad and Tobago is at a crossroads in terms of its politics, as you call it, this new era that we're entering, this new decade that we're entering. What does Trinidad and Tobago, there is no foreseeable leader on either side, especially the UNC, ahead for the foreseeable future. So what future does Trinidad and Tobago citizens have to look forward to?
Well, that's why these elections are so important. And either party has to realize that there has to be monumental change. Because unless there is monumental change, that situation that I described in my article is going to come to pass. I don't have to hold Guyana as a reference. I can hold several different countries around the world. I can hold Lebanon, the country where I've lived more than 22 years, as a reference. We've had enough. The corruption is stinking to the highest heavens, and we know that. So unless we realize that we have to put things in place whether it's either party, whether they bring new blood in, people with a different vision, people, as I said before, interested in performance, not politics, interested in public service, actual public service, and not enriching themselves, and then coming back in a reinvented form 5 or 10 years later.
Coming up, as the country reaches a breaking point.
David, what brings you back to Trinidad and Tobago? David, what brings you back to Trinidad and Tobago? You've done work in Mount Dore, Mount Hope, the Laventille, the St. Joseph Hills communities. What brings you back to Trinidad and Tobago? You speak like a politician.
Well, I'm not a politician, but politics, I think, has been part of my life since I grew up in those self-same hills. I have navel strings in those hills that you described, from Laventille to St. Joseph. And politics was a part of my family life. And it's something that I think that as every responsible citizen in Trinidad and Tobago, we need to get involved in. We cannot sit on the sidelines anymore and say, politics is not for me. We have to get involved unless we are prepared to be satisfied with this group of politicians that have brought us to this pass.
Are you willing to get involved?
Of course. Of course. I think now is the time. I've been told many times before, I've seen comments on my articles, well, why doesn't Nakhid get involved? Why doesn't he come home? Well, I have. And I intend to mobilize the citizenry around Trinidad and Tobago. I intend to mobilize the place where I grew up, the St. Joseph Hills, the Laventille Hills. I want the youth to realize they don't have to be cynical anymore. I want them to realize that there are leaders who are ready to help them, who are ready to make them, as I said before, stakeholders in their community, not hustlers, whereby every 4 or 5 years, a politician comes in, hands them money, and then leaves until the next 5 years. And we have to realize that. And the communities that are thriving, they have to realize it's for their own benefit. It's for their own livelihood.
Will you start a political party?
It's not about, but I don't know. I think it would be foolish to think that I can come in and start a political party. But there can be a vehicle for change that embraces people who are honest, people who have integrity, and people who have put public service at the forefront of their agenda.
Will David Nakhid join a political party?
Well, that's very, very, very much open for questioning right now. I'm talking with the youths on the ground, because that's the reality as I see it. I want a vehicle for change, and that can only happen in cabinet. I have to be realistic about that. That's where the power is. That's where the decisions are made that can affect these same youths that I described. And I think when the people of this country see real change, see something that they can really vote for and embrace, I think then you will see the activism that we have not seen in Trinidad and Tobago.
Which political party do you prefer?
I can't speak to a preference right now. I think we've been disappointed, but we have to embrace the fact that of the 58 years that we have been independent as a country, there has been a party that has controlled the treasury of this country for over 45 years, almost 85% of that time. And I think it would be foolish of us to deny that. And that's reality.
You only have 2 choices, David. You have the PNM and you have the UNC. There's nothing much beyond that.
Well,
is that part of our problem then?
Well, of course it is. But that's because we have not been active enough as a citizenry. We have basically given the mandate through our vote, and that has been our democracy. Our democracy has basically been to vote. We have not been really invested in how we go forward as a country.
You could have been out of this, really. You were a successful footballer, tremendous talent. You left Trinidad and Tobago when you were 17. You went into coaching. You're a successful coach as well. You have an international football academy. But throughout your life, even when you were a player, then when you were a coach, now in your 50s, you still have this burning desire to face social issues, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago. You were in jail in Lebanon for standing up for African players. What drives you? What drives you inside to continue this social fight?
Well, if I could answer that, Mr. Bechu, I would be happy to curb that instinct that I have. Then I wouldn't have gotten into so much trouble around the globe. But I think it's how I was brought up. I was brought up with a keen sense of fighting against injustice in my home. I was an avid reader, and I sometimes hid the fact that I read so much because I was an athlete, which was kind of looked down upon. And I think the struggles that I've witnessed from the Cuban Revolution to the revolution in Iran and all over the globe, where I've seen people, the plight of the Palestinians, I think I have realized that we must admit as a people, as global citizens, that the man at the bottom of the heap right now, the man at the bottom of the social pile, no matter what country that you are in, it's the black man, whether he be black or brown. That is the man who is oppressed right now. And I would say that unless we contribute to that fight, that revolution, to get justice, no matter what country you're in, whether it be Lebanon and it's the African players, whether you're in Trinidad and Tobago and it's a so-called Afro-Trinbagonian player or the so-called Indo-Trinbagonian citizen, we have to address that problem before it becomes something that burns the entire country.
Let's talk a little bit about 2015. In October 2015, you announced that you were going to be a FIFA presidential candidate. You were going to try to become a FIFA presidential candidate. The actual reality of you becoming it disappeared within 3 months. By December 2015, it was done. But what encouraged you to go after the FIFA presidency?
Well, basically the same thing. The parallel can be done with the societies in Trinidad and Tobago. The global inequity in football was tremendous. You had Europe at the top, way at the top, and you had the Caribbean and African countries way at the bottom in terms of funding, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of facilities. And I think that it reached the stage where I pointed out in my manifesto that soon the Caribbean and the African countries would be spectators to the sport. And so said, so done. We become spectators to the sport. We have all the channels to watch what? European football. Look at the finalists in the World Cup. So the Caribbean has basically been left behind. And not only now, even in the time when we had leaders who were in place, they never really gave us a construct within the Caribbean that we could have built upon. So now we have people in place now in our region that will not allow us to flourish and to explore our potential as we should have, and that's a pity.
You say that we're spectators here in the Caribbean. Are we further behind in the back row with the new CONCACAF qualification for World Cup rules?
Oh, definitely, definitely. This was done to make sure that what happened in 2018 with the United States doesn't happen again. That there's no way that they will not miss out on a qualification. What happened to them when Trinidad and Tobago knocked them out of the World Cup was an absolutely economic disaster for them. So I think they've put things in place to make sure that doesn't happen. It doesn't help the Caribbean countries at all. As a matter of fact, the Caribbean countries, I think, now are way behind. Look at the ranking of Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean countries. So I think because of the lack of leadership, and this goes back to my primal point, the lack of leadership within the Caribbean and the lack of leadership within Trinidad and Tobago political context have brought us to this sorry pass.
Coming up, David Nakhid's complicated relationship with a man who saved him, then sent him to slaughter.
What do you think his legacy is in Trinidad and Tobago football? Was he the hero, villain, or both? Had a bittersweet relationship with former FIFA Vice President Jack Warner. What do you think, he's now serving a lifetime ban in football, what do you think his legacy is in Trinidad and Tobago football? Was he the hero, villain, or both?
Well, you know, we have a saying that a good man can do bad things and a bad man can do good things. So what his legacy will be, I think that will be left to each individual. I had a very complex, and I still have a complex relationship with Mr. Warner. I think he was a brilliant man. I think, however, he put some of those qualities that would have helped not only Trinidad and Tobago, but the Caribbean. I think he put those to enrich himself. and not fully in the service of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Having said so, I consider him a friend, and it has been, as you have said, very bittersweet and complex. But I think that we've always respected each other and what we have accomplished. And I have to say he's the one who has came to my rescue at times. I have to be completely honest, and I am. And he's the one who has also contributed to me being blacklisted and being, because of my comments, which I think a lot of the Trinbagonians now realize were correct in 2005. He was the one primarily, I think, under pressure from that same community that I criticized to fire me from the Trinidad and Tobago national team.
15 years later, do you think you're still blacklisted in Trinidad and Tobago football? And, you know, how do you plan in an era where we've been through such a turbulent time, not only on the field, but especially in the administrative office with successive regimes? The new regime also has its troubles. Do you see yourself in a football association position soon? Or would you like to align yourself in that direction?
No, not at all. I think my greater impact, especially when I see the situation of our underserved youth in Trinidad and Tobago, I think I can have a greater impact in the political arena. Having said so, I'm never far from the football.
But what is wrong then in the administrative office that we've been, ever since rising to the top of our footballing history and qualifying for the 2006 World Cup, we've just depleted and the graph has gone down?
Well, there was no pathway or roadmap left by the people before. It was all a one-man show. Mr. Jack Warner was that show. And there's been nobody who, with either the resources that he had, or, to be honest, the intellectual capacity. They have all tried to mimic in some way how he did his business. And how he did his business was not a model that we should be ready to follow. He had success, but that is a success that does not really leave a legacy that you can build upon.
Your legacy in itself, there are things that Trinidad and Tobago does not like about you, the public, officials, administrators do not like about you. One of the things that nobody ever argues about is that you are perhaps one of Trinidad and Tobago's greatest ever footballers. You were one of the first man in the modern era to play across Europe. You played in Switzerland, you played in England, you played in Belgium, you went on to the MLS in America. Nowadays, we don't field that much players in top tiers across Europe. We have nobody in England, in the English Premier League, for the first time in a long time. Why?
Well, to correct you, Mr. Bichu, I didn't play in England. I played in Sweden with a young Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and I played in all those other countries that you mentioned. But having said that, you have to ask yourself why some of the people in Trinidad and Tobago would have disliked me. Obviously not because of the football I played. I think my performance was indicative of my talent, and I thank God for that. But I think as a people, we have been conditioned to be averse to people who speak their minds and force us to look at our condition. We want people who make us comfortable. That's how we are in Trinidad and Tobago. We want people to come and talk about wine and jam rather than somebody who comes and tell us, listen, this wine and jam is going to stop, and we're going to be faced with a situation where we are fighting each other on the streets. And that's the reality that I bring to my people. And I want to bring to my people with my writings, with my work, when I talk. I want you to realize that this cannot continue. The situation in the Laventil Hills, the situation in the Mongdo Hills, it cannot continue. It's going to affect the entire country. And that's why people tend to be uncomfortable, especially the people who want to hold on to power and to the treasury.
How far do you think that explosion that you speak of, the explosion that is happening right now in Chile, the explosion that is happening right now in Guyana, that happened in Venezuela, how far is Trinidad and Tobago away from exploding?
Hong Kong as well, Lebanon as well. Lebanon, we've had an ongoing revolution for the last 3-4 months with an economic meltdown. And you never know. It's like the coronavirus. Who would have thought this would have crept up on us, and in 3-4 months virtually locked down the entire globe, the entire world? That's the danger, especially when you incite racism, when you incite peoples against each other. Now, personally, I don't believe in the concept of race, but that's our reality on the ground, where we call ourselves so-called Indo-Trinbagonians, so-called Afro-Trinbagonians, so-called Syrian, Lebanese. It's crazy. It's all a way to keep ourselves apart, and the politicians are happy with that. And that's why I said before, as a vehicle for change, we need a party that removes that, that is all-inclusive, that realizes that our potential lies not only in our diversity, but in our coming together as a people to right the wrongs that we've had for the last 58 years.
David Nakhid, thank you very much for being on ViewPoint.
Thank you, Mr. Bechu.